Today I want to talk about something different, something I don't talk much about, and that's equipment. I've used a lot of lenses in the time that I've been taking photographs, and I've come to really love one of them in particular. I bought it about 6 or 7 years ago now, I think, and it was to replace an original lens, an old lens. I'd bought this 50mm f1.4 on this camera, the old Nikon FTN. It was my first camera, my first lens, and I used this lens for 27 or 28 years until I realised that it wasn't focusing properly all the time. And at first I thought, my eyes are going bad, I'm getting older and I'm not seeing it sharp. But I did some tests, realised it was only on that one lens that I was getting photos that were out of focus, and did some tests with it, took it into the repair guy that has done some work for me a lot of times, and he's really good, and he shot some test frames with it and took it off the camera and gave it back to me. He said, no, it's fine, Kevin, it's fine, there's nothing wrong with it. Then he changed the subject pretty quickly, and I think the translation of that was, buy a new one, it's too old. So I started to consider this. I started to consider what to do. Sure, I was going to need another 50mm, but I actually had realised over the years that I prefer a 35mm for the angle of view. And on a full frame camera, that is a little bit wider than the 50, and it actually matches our regular field of view, not including our peripheral vision, but it matches our regular field of view more closely. It's a little bit wider than what we see normally, and I like this. It suits the style of photography that I do. A lot of sort of documentary style and environmental portraits and travel photography, and this 35mm lens suits it just fine. What I was concerned about though was two things in particular, because I wanted to keep the flexibility of having the wide aperture, the f1.4 that my 50mm had, and I wanted to get a 35. If I was going to buy a 35, it was going to be the 1.4. Two things that I was concerned about. One was, what is the quality of the background like when it's out of focus? What's the bokeh like? And the other thing was a big consideration was, what's it going to cost me? Because to replace a little 50 like that with another 50mm, you can pick one up for a couple of $100 second hand. But I knew that this is a bit of an unusual lens. It's a bit of a specialist lens. I was not going to find one here in Thailand second hand, and to buy it new, I was a little bit cautious. So I got online, I got into the B&H photo and video website, and there was examples there of the background bokeh, and it was absolutely gorgeous, just beautiful and soft and really lovely. And then I looked at the price tag, and it was $1,600 US, and it was like, ooh, that's an expensive piece of glass, that's a pricey lens. But I kind of figured it out in my head. I thought, well, I've had 27 years worth of use out of this lens, and it's been absolutely fantastic. Even if I get just 10 years worth out of use out of this lens, it's only going to cost me 40 something cents a day, so less than 50 cents a day. At the moment, I calculated it the other day, it's costing me 73 cents a day roughly, and it's worth every single cent. As you can see, this used to be black as well. It's well worn, it's well loved. I have this lens on my camera most of the time. It suits what I do. It's very, very versatile. I find that I can shoot a lot of different styles and a lot of different subjects with it easily and effectively. And the street photography and travel photography that I love to do, this lens is really my first choice. It allows me to get wide shots of an open scene, a general scene, without going too wide. Sometimes, sure, I have to zoom with my feet and move back a little bit to get that extra width in. And then it also allows me to get closer in, to get medium shots and pretty close-up shots. It's not going to do macro, it focuses into about 30 centimetres, and that's pretty close. It's good enough for most street photography and the sort of things that I do with documentary photography and so on. So it's a practical and versatile lens. I love it for environmental portraits because it allows me to frame my subject and be close enough to them to be able to communicate and relate to them and still show enough of the background, still show enough of what they're doing and where they are. And it gives me also, because it's the f1.4, it gives me the flexibility, a lot of scope to choose how much of my background is in focus and how much blur is involved. I don't always like to have a really, really blurry background or a really, really sharp background. And having the option to be reasonably close to my subject and still get a significant amount of blur on the background, yet still see the detail enough to be able to put the person in the context of what they're doing, I find creates a really nice environmental portrait. I also use it for regular portraits, not all the time. I've got my other favourite lens, my 105, and I usually use that for the portraits, especially when we're using the outdoor studio. But with the 35mm, sometimes I'll just pop it on. Usually once I've gotten comfortable, or once my subject has gotten comfortable with me, because I have to get a bit closer. And so getting a bit closer usually requires that you've got a bit of a rapport. So I build that up, and then putting the 35mm on allows me to come closer to my subject and get a more intimate feel to a portrait, a more closer feeling, a more relational feeling to the subject than if I'm standing further back with a longer lens. And I find sometimes this really works well. And the combination of the two, the 35mm and the 105mm for portraits, is really, quite wonderful. It's also a good lens for other sorts of photography, other types of pictures like architectural shots and landscape shots. I don't do a whole lot of either of those, but I find the 35mm f1.4 works for both those styles. The 1.4 setting in architecture and in landscape photography is kind of irrelevant. I don't really use it very often, if at all, for those two types of photography, because mostly I'll be wanting a narrower aperture setting and seeing a lot more in focus than I'll get with f1.4. Occasionally with a landscape shot, I'll want something really close in the foreground and to be able to control the amount of blur in the background. And again, this lens really allows me to do that well because of the wide aperture. So, that's what, the wide aperture is what costs the extra hundreds of dollars to be able to purchase this lens, but I don't regret it at all. It's been a really fabulous lens to use, and I've grown to really love it. And I find a lot of people will lust after equipment. They'll see new gear and go, "Oh wow, that looks nice. That's a cute lens. That's a nice body." But it takes time to really learn to love a piece of camera equipment, and this is what's happened with this lens. I've got it. I use it a lot. I've become very familiar with it. I know the settings. I know how far away I need to be at what certain aperture to be able to get a decent blurred background, or to be able to get enough of my subject's face in focus. You just get a feeling for a prime lens, a fixed focal length lens, differently than you can do, and I find it more easily than you can do than a zoom lens. With a zoom, you've got so many different parameters, there's so much variety of angles that you can get and focal lengths that you can achieve, that it's difficult to find a real feeling for a lens like that as easily as I can find for a prime lens. And this 35mm is something that's grown quite close to my heart. I love it a lot, and I'll continue to use it and continue to search for new ways of using it, new subjects that I can photograph, and photograph the same subjects, environmental portraits and street photography, travel photography, in new ways to try and keep improving what I can do with this lens. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to click subscribe and give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and check out some of the others on our channel as well. Cheers.